All right. Good evening, everybody, or good morning, depending on when you're watching and or listening to this. My name is Chris Comstock. I get to serve as a pastor down here in Georgia, and I'm excited to have everybody join us tonight. I've got my newfound friend. I always point it the wrong way. My newfound friend, Grant Hightower, with us tonight, and we're going to hear from him in just a minute. But I always try to give at the front end just an idea as to why we do what we do here. I will say, for the third consecutive week, it is raining on my back porch, thus affirming that I need to get a screened-in porch in order to keep doing this week in and week out. But let me just tell you guys why we do what we do. In Mark chapter 2, I was reading through a few months back. The turmoil of our nation was kind of continuing to compile on top, really pile on top of each other. As really tragedy after tragedy occurred. And I began to read in Mark chapter 2, and this passage really stuck out to me and has been really a milestone for me in this season of life. This is what it says in Mark chapter 2, verse 2. It says, "Soon the house where Jesus was staying was so packed with visitors that there was no more room even outside the door. And while he was preaching God's word to them, 4 men arrived carrying a paralyzed man on a mat. They couldn't bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, so they dug a hole through the roof above his head, and then they lowered that man on his mat right down in front of Jesus." And that just stuck out as much as it did. It stuck out to me because the guys who were carrying the paralyzed man knew nothing of this man's struggle. They'd never been paralyzed themselves. They never walked in his shoes, and they recognized, however, that it was important for them to help him, to learn his story, to carry his burden. And they did just that. They picked him up, they walked with him as long as it took, and they took him to where he could get help, to where he could find healing. And I believe in our nation and in our world that there is no greater opportunity than for us to sit with people, to learn from people, and to get and find healing. And we get to do just that. Every week on this show, we get to bring on people, hear their stories, learn from them. And my hope and my prayer is that we begin to find that unity is truly greater than division, and that we can come together instead of continuing to fight this battle apart. And so, why do we do it on the back porch? Why don't you just go inside where it's nice and dry? That's a great question. I believe that the back porch is an important piece of what we do. And the reason why is you don't just invite anybody to your back porch. You invite people that you want to come through your house to see all your mess, to see all your stuff on the floor, to see your messy house. But you invite them into your life. You invite them into your journey. You invite them into your process. And it's oftentimes that I've found that on the back porch, we get to have the most intimate conversations. Those conversations that you don't normally have sitting out at Texas Roadhouse or even sitting on your couch. It's often in these moments where we get to have them sitting right here. And so that is why I bring people to my back porch. Right now, we can't bring them physically, and so we bring them digitally, which I think is a really great opportunity for us to learn from one another and to grow together. And so we do this week in and week out. And I believe it is a conversation worth having. It's a conversation and a dialogue that I believe is important and should be heard. So with that in mind, I want to encourage you in this moment here to do the things that you could do to share this. So maybe that's telling somebody about it, but maybe right now it's liking this, sharing it, tagging your friends in it, all those kind of things. Subscribe to our channels on YouTube, here on Facebook, you can like us, or on any of our audio platforms. We want to encourage you to do that, to continue to be a part of the conversation week in and week out, even after tonight finishes. So without further ado, I want to turn to my guest tonight, a guy who I met just a few days ago, honestly. We met through a mutual both in a research each other and said, yeah, this is a conversation we want to have together. So I want to introduce to you guys tonight my friend Grant Hightower. Grant serves as the director at Metco in Boston, Massachusetts. He has a really incredible history of working alongside people and learning how to love people well, how to fight for people well, and above all that, how to fight for unity in the middle of all of it. And with that in mind, Grant, I'd love for you just to introduce yourself, tell the people that are watching and listening a little bit about who you are and what you get to do.
Yeah, man, Chris, I appreciate, first and foremost, you having me on and inviting me to the back porch to sit down and have some open dialogue with you. I think it's really important that people have the opportunity to see different kinds of folks interact and be vulnerable with one another. So again, I salute you for having the courage to open up your home to others and to kind of be an example of what open and honest discourse can look like.
I appreciate that.
So again, I'm Grant Hightower. I'm living right now in the Boston metro area. I'm a father of four with a lovely wife, and I've been at this human service thing for quite a long time. I would say that this is not a profession for me. This is just the happenstance of my life. I was born and raised in a small rural town in Connecticut called Ledyard. Anybody in the Northeast, or maybe even in the world, if you've ever stopped at a Foxwoods Casino, you probably come through my neighborhood. And as much as country as it was, and I know, Christian, we spoke before. I told you at this point, I think it's become more Trump country than anything. When I was growing up, it was really a great place to grow up for my brother and I and my family. And I don't think that had anything to do with the external factors. We did have, nice friends and we had good neighbors, but my parents allowed for us to have cultural experiences fortified within the home, and they really did a good job of insulating my brother and I from anti-Black racism when we were coming up. And so my friend group and our affinity group, in our neighborhood, we were close. I didn't really experience hardcore racism until I got into the second grade. And I know that might sound like that's very early for a lot of people, but again, my childhood was pretty full. Um, I remember my first two grade school teachers, my kindergarten teacher, Miss Cobb, my first grade teacher, Miss Colosi. And after that, it was pretty much downhill. Um, Again, I didn't face a lot of racism from my peers, but adults, I don't know if it was an adultification bias because I was a larger, brown kid. But like I said before, we grew up right off of a Native American reservation, and they were pig farmers and they were poor. And so everybody was lumped up into everybody that was brown was put in the same pot, and we were all treated poorly. And to the point where uh, educators in my school, in my elementary school, had a rolling file that they would pass from grade to grade on all the brown kids around behavior and things to expect. And whenever there would be like disciplinary marks on the board, it would always be the brown students. And I had teachers come to me and say that I shouldn't expect much of myself, to things like that, to I shouldn't get too comfortable speaking to the white girls in class because that wasn't my place. And so that's where I started to really have some dissonance and create distance between the white world and myself. And I started to become callous and frustrated. But I would say that the turning point for me in really embracing racism and trying to figure out where I stood in it was I was maybe in fourth or fifth grade, and I remember watching a documentary on HBO. And this is right around the time where AOL online is coming into the fold and the internet is beginning to become something. And the documentary, funny enough, was about how racism was moving from the backcountry or from the woods or from the halls of um, legislators or legislation into or online. And they showed a clip of this a white kid my age, and he was playing this game called Doom, and Doom was a big video game at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
he had programmed Doom. He had programmed the monsters to look like black guys. So they had dreadlocks and jeans, like they were living in the inner city. And that just blew my mind, not because of how he was able to program it, but that he actually thought to do that. And the purpose of the game is to kill these monsters and make your way through the labyrinth. And so at that point, um, I could not tolerate the sensitivity that I was feeling of all the microaggressions and macroaggressions and the barbs and the words. It was just killing me, and I was a pretty sensitive kid. Luckily, my mother was a librarian, and so she worked every Saturday at the Westerly Public Library. And so I started going with her, and I would go to the reference section, and I would start pulling out, old archived footage and papers and clippings, and I would just sit and read about the Scottsboro Boys, or I would read about Black Wall Street, or I'd read about all the degradation and kind of and racial violence and animus is a part of America's fabric. And I would look at clippings of lynchings, and then I would read books by James Baldwin. And this is when I'm in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and so I'm starting to understand the perspective of Black folks in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And what you are able to do at that age is you can link the bridge that things have not changed in, at that point, 30 years from the 60s. This is 1997, 98. So things were the same for people growing up in this era that we're being taught was so far away, and then we've moved so forward with. But you realize that we're experiencing a lot of the same things, and clearly the same attitudes are being played out in the power dynamic. And so that's kind of where racism for me really, well, that's why I decided that was where I needed to go in terms of racism. So high school was I had some good experiences, I had some poor experiences. But once I left high school, man, I was ready to get out of Ledyard and move on to see what the rest of the world had to offer. And then from there, man, it was like foot on the gas, and I am where I am now. So that's kind of how I came up.
That's so interesting to me. And I have a question I'm going to ask you later as we dig into your education side.
Sure.
But let me just ask you this: when you experienced that, and now we're talking about 2nd grade. I mean, you're what, 6, 7 years old at this point.
Yeah.
And obviously you said it progressed all the way through. Did that change the way that you attempted to present yourself? Did it change the way you acted, the way you talked to people? Like, what did that do to your psyche at that point in order just to kind of, I don't know, stay off that ledger, to stay out of those books? I mean, did that have to shift and change who you were?
So I think that what I've never forgiven maybe myself for, and definitely have never forgiven who I'll call my tormentors or the agitators, I became a very angry child. I was so angry, and I did a speech in February at Dean College in just outside of Boston, and I said where I said for the first time maybe publicly that my parents had to come in and have a conversation with the school counselor because I said I wanted to kill myself. I did not want to be around. This is 3rd grade, so right a year later, I'm feeling that pent up. The way that I catalyzed my pain was through anger and violence and rage. The way some other Black students or students of color catalyze it is to try to assimilate, to try to relinquish their Blackness in order to fit in, right? Other kids become completely shut down. Other kids flee. It just depends. For me, I just became a very angry individual. And that stayed with me for a really long time. And it ended up bleeding into a lot of my relationships, just my other human relationships. That was something I had to work through. As a husband, as a father, I had to figure out how to dig that up and deal with it and put it to the side. But I would also say that it also triggered something in me that made me want to be the person that I did not have when I was going through those things. And so I don't know if it was equal parts rage and I just wanted to prove it. I just wanted to show these people that they didn't beat me. Pride maybe is what it is. But there was a part of me that was not so vengeful, but knew that there needed to be somebody to step in to support the next group of young folks that was coming up behind me that did not have a me, because there was no Black or brown, clearly male educator or person in the school system that was going to champion what kids like myself were going through and kids that I knew were going through. Because I lost a lot of friends just because of the way that they were treated. Not necessarily that they're alive, but they did not. I feel like they missed out on opportunities to be who they truly could have been because people derailed them out of their own fear or centering themselves in these people's lives in order to kind of derail them. There's just no place for that, especially with young people.
Yeah, I agree. I want to ask you a question. We didn't ask in the pre-show, but as you're talking about it, I just want to dig in for a second into, you've got 4 kids of your own now.
Yeah.
What you experienced coming up at a very young age.
Yeah.
Has that has that shaped how you parent and shepherd them, like care for them, love them, the questions you ask them, because at this age, this is what I went through, and I hope they don't have to, but I also, like, we're both realists. You already said it. Not as much as we want to believe that things are changing, and they are at some level. More dialogues are happening like this.
Mm-hmm.
They're still experiencing a whole lot of darkness in this world, and so
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, has that shaped the way that you guys parent your kids, the conversations you're having with them? Does that? I mean, I don't think I have to. Like, for me, I'll just tell you, like, I have a 9-year-old and about to be a 6-year-old. I don't have to have these conversations with my kids.
Mm.
And I'm not saying that like boastfully. I'm saying that because I've never thought about the fact
It's
that
not
you're
on the
having to have,
agenda.
yeah, like I don't have to think about the fact that my kids might be looked at differently than your kids would be. So how does that change from a parenting style for you?
So the one thing that I left out in trying to answer your question previously was that I also had parents who would have those conversations with me. So they modeled
Uh,
how to incorporate culturalism, to give my brother and I some substance and understanding of the black and brown diaspora, that we're
mhm,
not a monolith. And I think that
yeah,
there's a lot of people who look at the black experience as a singular experience because a lot of times it's a single story that makes the news or is in the media or
sure.
is displayed through the lives of athletes or prominent black folks who have a platform. They tend to market the same story. My parents did a really good job of giving us the difference between, a George Washington Carver and like a Langston Hughes, or the difference between Jesse Owens and Jack Johnson,
Mm,
people who were inside of the same profession but live completely different lives based on their circumstances, right?
right.
And it just showed us how different black and brown people made it in America. Everybody was not everybody that was important wasn't a celebrity. Everybody that had something to offer wasn't somebody that was on television. There's all these different kinds of black and brown bodies that have value to, or that added value to the fabric of this country. And so, with that being said, it was really important for my wife and I to be able to have those same kinds of conversations and expose our children to culture so that they could have perspective. Because we can never dictate or predict what kinds of people are going to come in and out of their lives or who they're going to encounter. But there were also some clear decisions that we made to try to preserve their innocence. One of those was getting them in a charter school and instead of sending them to the local public school. We live in a fairly diverse community, but it is still, I would say, homogeneously white. And then the next ranking demographic is Latino, and my wife happens to be Afro Latina. So for us, the charter school, it's like 95%, 98% Latino. And so we didn't have that experience being in a homogeneously brown or black setting. My wife came up her mother is a first generation Dominican immigrant. And so she went to school in Roxbury Public Schools, Boston Public Schools. And for my wife, she grew up in kind of a rural area for the first few years of her life. So she was in a predominantly white school, just like myself. And so it was important for us to expose our kids to maybe a different experience and hope for some different outcomes. And we knew that on the human side, they were still going to run into some of um, those human interactions that we want to avoid, right? You're going to run into some bullying. You're going to run into some people who have more money than you. You're going to run into these human
Of
things,
course.
but the racial thing in both of our experience, it took a little bit more out of us than we felt was necessary at way too young of an age. And so in order to try to preserve their innocence, we did have some strategic planning sessions around, like, well, where do we live? What makes sense? My parents, like I said, they fortified us in that community. I didn't have my friends did not tend to come to my house. I usually left my house to go there. I think that was intentional by my parents in order to try to keep some semblance of peace and privacy in our home. We're more open. My wife is more of an open, like, kind of a hostess lady. She loves to have people
Yeah.
around. She likes the energy. So we have people in and out of the house. But even still, we don't just let anybody into the circle. So I think that's because of some of the pain that we had
Yeah.
coming up. You know what I mean? So yeah, there's definitely been some strategic things that have been done. The other thing I wanted to add about that too is I don't have. You hear a lot on the media about Black people or Black parents having to have the talk with their kids, and I don't know if this is fortunate or unfortunate. I never necessarily planned to have this conversation, but my son has been with me in the front seat when I've been pulled over twice, and so he's actually had a a firsthand
front row
opportunity
seat.
to study, literally a front row seat to study how you can interact with police officers in a hostile stop and in just a routine, stop by a trainee police officer. So, those are things I know are going to stay with him. Luckily, though, for me and for him, they ended with me driving off, unlike some of the other encounters that we see. But that's one of the things that you have to consider.
Yeah, I 100% get it. I've spoken to guys who've said they've had to have those conversations as young as 3 and 4 years old, and I just, it just racks my brain that those are the conversations we have to be having, that you guys have to be having. It breaks my heart that there's a certain level of innocence that disappears once you have those conversations. And I know I've had them with my kids, and there's a certain level of them going, wait, this happens? Like, people don't like each other because of the way they look? I'm like, unfortunately. And there's that level of like, but that's not me. Like, you know what I mean? But I know it's not you, buddy, but unfortunately, like, you're just going to interact with this. And that just really, at the end of the day, it sucks, man. Like, that's the lifestyle that we have and that you guys have to grow your children up in. I know that you've had a ton of experiences led you to where you are now.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about specifically a couple of those incidents that have kind of really put you on the path you are now, and the voice that you have, the conversations that you have, the way that you post things on social media, the conversations you're willing to have. The one that really always sticks out to me, especially after hearing your story coming up in school, is that somehow you ended up in education on the other side of that. So you decided, instead of writing off education and saying, you know what, these guys were jerks to me, you stepped in. Now, again, I know this is kind of your current career. There was some before this that we'll talk about. But the irony to me is that this is where you're at now. This is what you do. And I just wonder, like, what led you to that point? What brought you to the point where you said, you know what, education's it for me? And I know you can kind of start by talking about what you do specifically and how you utilize your platform now to help bring change. But I am interested to hear what was it for you that you said education's it for me?
So student growth, adolescent and youth preservation, I guess, is at the core of everything that I do. Most of the things that I do professionally. And so what I do now, I'm the METCO director. METCO stands for Metropolitan Council for Educational Opportunity. It was the company, or the initiative was started in 1966 by just neighborhood parents in Boston. They saw that there were overcrowded, underfunded schools in Boston, so they took it upon themselves. It was called Operation Exodus at the time. They took it upon themselves to carpool their kids out of the city into suburban schools that had more space and more resources. When the Civil Rights Act was passed, a few years later, a man named Judge Garrity out of Wellesley, he was a judge. He passed a busing bill and basically forced busing, or forced the desegregation of Boston city schools. And so the METCO program kind of took off officially from that point. If you're familiar with the history of the Boston educational system or politics in Boston, that was a pretty gross time. One of the most prominent, famous, maybe photos in American history is of a young white man with an American flag getting ready to run it through a black man who's splayed by two other white kids, and that was on the steps of Boston City Hall. I think a lot of times people think that was somewhere in Alabama or in the South somewhere, but that was right here. I'm in the Northeast, and so it was a pretty messy, bloody, nasty time. So moving up 50 plus years, primarily what I do is I provide the social, emotional, strategic support for students of color who live in the Boston neighborhoods. And what we do is we bus them from the city of Boston out to several different suburban districts outside of Boston so that they can access equal education. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's a great opportunity for families to send their kids to schools that are going to give them an opportunity to continue their education if that's what they choose to do, or be placed in some sort of apprenticeship program if that's where they choose to go. The other side of that sword, I guess, is something that I always say to the people that I work with, which is we should be working to actively, work ourselves out of a job. There really shouldn't be a reason in 2020 that we have to take kids from their neighborhoods, particularly one of the shining cities in the country who champions how great their educational system is. That we should be busing them away from the city schools because they don't have the resources, they don't have the staff, they don't have the outcomes that they want. I think all of our kids should be able to go to school where they live. And so that's kind of the messed up piece of it. But my job is to source everything, to get these kids on a bus to the school, work with the school leadership to make sure that our kids are having equitable access to education, getting them the services that they need, partnering with community organizations, small businesses to support kids with technology, with after-school opportunities, with internship opportunities, and also just supporting families with any sort of resources that we can. So it's a pretty large-scale job, and there are 31 other directors who run their own districts across the state or across Eastern Massachusetts. So my territory or my district is the Reading School District. So that's primarily what I do now. I got there from being a METCO coordinator. So I'm a director now. I was a coordinator at a previous original METCO district, which was in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And I did a lot of great work there, building student coalitions and just being kind of a outspoken champion for the students there. And only ended up falling into education. Part of it was intentional because, again, I've always wanted to work with young people. But prior to getting into the 9-to-5, I guess, educational system, I was working as a sexual abuse counselor at a now defunct program called Jermaine Lawrence, which is in Arlington, Massachusetts. And it had a number of different residential facilities for young women. There were some for eating disorders. There were some for girls who were truant, girls who were running away from home, who were involved in sex trafficking, unfortunately. And then my dorm, which was for what they called sexual aggression. And the funny story about that is, I don't know, we spoke about it earlier, but when I was in college, I was working at a homeless shelter. And maybe like 2 years in, the shelter shut down, and I was looking for a job. And as I'm looking, I get a call from my girlfriend, who's my wife now. She says, "Hey, bud, I'm pregnant, so what are we going to do?" And so I move up to the Boston area to start our family, and I need to find a job. And so I'm looking for anything that's similar to the counseling I was doing as a drug abuse counselor at the homeless shelter. And I found this place. And so I go into the interview, and I remember looking at the different kinds of programs they had. And I remember distinctly saying, there's no way I'm going to work in. And I don't even know what sexual aggression means. That a man shouldn't be able to work there. I know I'm not going to get there. And the first person to come through the door was the program director for, it's called Adam's House. And he just looked at me. I knew I was going to get the job. And so he's talking to me. And he's like, "Yeah, man, we could use you. You're a big guy. We could use you." So, he went through my resume. We talked, and I would say that was probably one of the turning points in my life, just because of the intensity of the work environment, but also because of the compassion that you learn, also because of the listening skills that I learned. And then I was one of maybe like 10 males in the entire organization. I was the only male that worked in this house. And so, I think the girls naturally attached to me because I presented as a father figure to a lot of them, and they didn't have that male energy around because they couldn't leave the facility. But what that helped me understand was how big of a role you can play either positively or negatively in the life of not just young people, but in particular in that scenario, young women. And that was my first real encounter with like ideas around feminism and ideas on how to be a tender caretaker and not just be this. I mean, I was an athlete. I was coming from more of a not machismo, but clearly a patriarchal mindset, right? And I was definitely selfish because it was all about me. But I was going to be a dad, and these young girls in a lot of ways helped me understand how to be larger than myself, and so that was awesome.
Yeah, that's so good. So let me ask you this, kind of in going into that, I think you've brought some really good points. One, that I know we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, that even in some of our most liberal cities that are championing those equal rights, there's still brokenness. They're still trying to figure it out too. And I appreciate the work you're doing because you're helping to bridge that gap.
Yeah,
But also, the thing I love about what you said is that you're ever increasingly attempting to work yourself out of a job, right? Like the big picture end goal is you get to come in one day and they go, "We don't need you anymore. We've got it." And you're like, "Great, I'm out. I'll happily find a new profession." I think that's a fantastic because great leaders recognize when they no longer need to be in a place. They don't handicap the place so that they can keep staying there.
right. So you can keep making money, right?
Yeah, and I appreciate your heart in that because that's a different mentality. Your mentality is I'm going to fight until this is fixed, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing. Not I'm going to fight hard enough to keep my paycheck, to keep my family afloat. And I just really appreciate your heart in that. I think it tells a lot about who you are as a person. It tells a lot about your character. Let me ask you one other thing that you brought up, especially when it comes to the girls' home and the homeless center you worked in, and in both of those centers, you really worked as an advocate, as an ally for the people that you were working alongside of. And I just wonder if maybe you can share some life lessons that you learned out of those experiences that helped you become a better ally, a better advocate. Some things that we can, those who are listening, those who are watching, can personally take and say, this is how I can become an advocate, somebody who's fighting for people the right way.
Yeah.
What are some lessons that you've learned along the way? Because you shared some great things with me, and I'd love for you to be able to help show some of the people that are listening just some great ways to do that.
Yeah. So one of the stories that I shared with you was before I worked at the homeless shelter. When I would see somebody who was on the street, I was that guy who would stop and give them the largest denomination I had in my pocket because I'm in my head. I'm doing something to support this person. And when I started working there, I realized that there were a fair number of people who were on the street who had money, who had income, right? They had different forms of income, whether it was legal or illegal, whether it was from the government or whatever, because they were working and they just whatever the situation was, they didn't need me to fix them. And so one of the things that I would ask anybody who's worried about what it takes to be an ally is first you have to be courageous. And you have to do some introspection. You have to look at yourself and say, well, what have I been doing that's contributing to the system that I want to change? What has my role been in that? And be honest about that.
Wow,
You can be honest with yourself at first because you don't have anybody judging, or you have the safety of yourself to write things down and say, this is what I'm doing to contribute to xenophobia. This is what I'm doing to contribute to the patriarchy. This is what I'm doing to contribute to a racist society or white supremacy, whatever it is, whatever you're trying to help. But once you get and there are resources out there that can help you kind of go through that. But once you get to that point, you have to decentralize yourself from the mission. So I say this to teachers a lot. When you take yourself out of the equation in regard of being the reason why a student succeeds or fails, and you then become the person that kind of encapsulates their progress through an issue or through a barrier, you serve them more of a purpose because it becomes less about you and what you would do if you were in their shoes with their attributes or whatever, right? And it becomes more about, well, now I can see things at a macro level. I can see where your strengths are, and I'm going to tell you what you're good at. I'm going to give you that praise. And I can see where you need some support and some constructive criticism. And so I'm going to give it to you in a way that makes sense for you because I'm thinking about things from that perspective, not from I'm the teacher, I'm supposed to know, this is my this has been my experience. This is what's worked for me and people that I know that look like me that have gone through the same system. And so, right, forget all that. Decentralize yourself and put
Good.
the student or the person, in front of you, and then just help guide. Just like when you're teaching a kid to ride a bike, or when you're teaching them to drive, or when you're teaching them you don't take it for them, you guide, right?
Yeah,
So that's one
that's
thing
good.
to do. So, right, you have to be vulnerable, and you have to decentralize yourself or decenter yourself. The other thing is you have to have some humility, and that kind of goes with the self-reflection piece. And that's humility can look different for different people in different ways. When I'm in a seminar about race, part of my humility is not getting to a place in my head where I say, well, I've read that text, so I know I don't need to listen to what this person's saying, because I might miss a vital perspective or piece of perspective that could be a missing link for me to continue my work. If you're somebody who's new to something, humility might look like being okay with sitting back for the first time and listening with intent, and not listening to defend or deflect, right? Just allowing things to just be, allowing people to say what they need to say without analyzing it to protect yourself, and just allowing folks to just say what needs to be said. So being humble is something that's also really important. So then you want to have clearly some critical thinking, right? You want to be able to ask yourself questions around, well, what have I always thought about this issue? And what are some of the questions that I've been avoiding that can help me move to a place of action? So moving from theory into how can I make this work for me in the setting that I'm trying to work in, or how can I help these people realize this concept so that we can begin to do the work instead of kind of doing the performative acts. And so I think that having that critical thinking skill, and then also be an active listener. I said that a little bit, but around humility, but being an active listener, man, you can learn so much from just letting somebody come to you and say what's on their heart. So I was in a seminar today, and we were talking about race, and a young white lady, or a white lady came and she said, I'm worried about being authentic and not being performative in what I'm doing, and I don't want people just to think that I'm just the white person who's just trying to speak for everybody. And how do I go about having these conversations without people thinking that I'm being phony? And my response to her was, I use an example, and I said, when we're talking about how do we support our students through virtual learning, do you survey your parents and ask how they can be allies for you using their perspective on what they're seeing at home? Or do you look at them as additional students that are a drag on what you're trying to accomplish? I said, have you ever surveyed the people around you that you're trying to support? So if you're telling me that you're trying to be an advocate for Black folks, have you ever had a conversation with a Black constituent of yours or a Black family of yours, and not in the sense of tell me how to help you, but you can go and be general. Hey, this situation is going on. How do you feel about this? And letting that person just talk, letting them have fellowship with you, or letting them give a testimonial about what they're feeling, what they're seeing, what they wish was different, and then use your critical thinking skills to connect the dots on how you can insert yourself to begin to engage that issue or incorporate what these Black families are feeling and seeing and what their fears are into what you're going to do for the upcoming year, or how you're going to change your classroom, or how you're going to engage a larger conversation with more Black families so that they feel like this is an affinity space where they can say things and be vulnerable, so that you can gather more information to make more strategic planning, right? So it's just like, but why continue to act as if there's no information outside of your circle? Go to the people who have the information that you're looking for, right? So, or that you're looking to get. And so I just think that that's another really, really big part of being an ally is also making yourself available to the people who you're actually trying to support. If I'm working with those girls and I don't know anything about what it is to be a 13-year-old girl, I'm not going to go ask my homeboy who's another 30-year-old dude. Right? No, I'm going to say, hey, tell me a little bit about Justin Bieber and why he's so cool, right? And it's like,
he's not.
Right?
No.
Right? And for us, he's not, but
yeah,
that link right there, the answer that she gives me might be the difference between me supporting her through her next trial, or just being somebody who she brushes off as another adult who doesn't care. And that's what I'm
right.
trying to say. Like, it might, decentering yourself, it might not mean anything to me, but it
Right.
means something to the person you're trying to support and serve. So,
That's good. I was writing down what you said
yeah.
because I'm going to put it back up once we're done tonight. I think it's so great. Just to recap, I want to give out these ideas again. First, it starts with being courageous, decentralizing ourselves from the situation, uh, not making ourselves the center of it. Listening with humility. I love that. And you also said listening with intent, which I thought was such a good idea, like that active listening, but listening with intent. Critical thinking, and I love how you said it, moving from theory to action.
Yeah.
So I think that's great because at some point you got to, at the end, your brain has to move from that point of this is a theory to this is what I need to do about it now. And then the last one you said was making yourself available, which is so good, like being willing to sit in the room and have the conversations.
Got to.
It's
You
so
have
good.
to. You have to. I mean, there's a thing in organizational management when you're trying to run a school building as a principal. I can't remember the exact verbiage for it, but basically it's like it's just making yourself available. So instead of being the principal who goes to the front door, goes to the office, closes the door, and just takes phone calls and answers emails, you're walking the halls, you're picking up the trash, you're having the conversation with the kid who always sits in the corner, you're talking to the teacher who's a little bit frazzled, talking to the veteran, right? You're making yourself available and seen, and I think that translates really well to just being a good human being, right?
Yeah.
It's twofold. It serves you because you get to understand the people that you're around, but it also serves the people that you're serving because they see that you are accessible and that you're not this mythological figure who you're supposed to respect because you have a title, but they learn what you're about, and so you earn their respect, and it becomes a mutual kind of symbiosis. So
yeah, people want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be honored, they want to be loved.
right.
Those things all come through the steps you just gave us. I think that's so pivotal. Well, Grant, thank you, man. I feel like I learned a ton, of course, tonight, even from our conversation just a few days ago. I feel like I'm still learning from you, and I appreciate your willingness to come on and share. I'd be interested to see if you had some resources, some ways for people to grow. I always encourage people, if they're just starting out, especially in the race conversations, to check out Be the Bridge, to get the book, to engage critically, to learn everything you can about that. So what are some resources you would push out to say, hey, here are some opportunities for you to grow, or some resources you can check out?
So I'm gonna give you those, but before I do that, I wanted to push back at something that you have brought up earlier. So we were talking about having the talk and dealing with law enforcement. You said how those are not conversations that you have to have, right? Because you have the privilege to not have to engage in those things.
Yeah.
But I would ask if in your role you're trying to give your kids the keys to be empowered to step in for maybe my kids when they see them on a screen. What kind of conversations are you willing to have with your kids, or what kind of conversations are you modeling within your own home, even though they don't directly benefit or preserve their life, but can help them become people that maybe preserve somebody else's?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I appreciate you asking it. I think for me, personally, for me and my family, we try to have conversations to recognize that first and foremost, we are called to protect people regardless of what they look like. That if there's a situation that arises around us that we see, and we teach our kids, there's certain, obviously, I think we all have those conversations of the no-no zones, people aren't allowed to touch, things like that. But we've begun, and again, we're not perfect at this. I'll be honest enough to say that. But we've started having those conversations over these last really few years as we've really engaged with this topic around how to recognize when a conversation isn't going the way it ought to be going, and how to step in for people in that moment. And so I've been proud to see my son step up for people, even when it doesn't make him the popular kid. My daughter isn't quite there yet, but she recognizes even now, because here's what I've learned, Grant. I think you know this is true as well. Your kids are going to learn more from what you do than what you say. And I want my kids know I do this. My kids see our friend base. My kids see who we hang out with, and they recognize, and I tell them, that we're never going to be the family that hangs out with people who just look like us. That's no fun.
Mhm.
You can learn from everybody that sits at the table with us. And I feel like we're not perfect at it, but we're striving towards it. I appreciate the challenge in it because at the end of the day, I want my kids to step in. I would hope that my kids would not be afraid to step in when they see injustice. And that's going to come. I mean, there's going to come a day when they're going to have to do it. I just feel it in my bones. I know it because I don't know. I just feel like if you're looking for it, you'll step in for it.
Sure.
And so I'll just tell you, like, we're taking steps as a family to step in when we see something. And if my kids watch me do it, then they're going to imitate that. They're going to see that and go, I'm going to be like
Sure.
dad because dad did the right thing at the right time. And I
Mhm.
don't say that boastfully as though we're
No, I
so
understand.
perfect at it because we're not. There are times when we go, I should have stepped in, and we have that conversation. Hey, do you remember when we saw that?
That's
We should
great.
talk about that.
Mhm.
And again, and I would say it's not even just with color because
Sure.
there's a lot of,
A lot of
unfortunately,
issues.
a lot
Yeah.
of issues that you have to
Yeah.
kind of coach and train your family to have conversations about. And if you don't have it now, then you're not going to raise up a family that fights for the right things. And we want to be a family that fights for justice for all, not justice for some.
Sure.
And so, that's a great. I appreciate you pushing back on me, man.
No,
Uh,
it's convo, right? So you let me in the house, so
100%.
I had to ask you something, man.
No, you know what? And this is what I told some of our coworkers this week. The most important piece of what we're doing in these conversations is dialogue, not monologue. It's
Sure.
being willing to ask each other's uncomfortable questions that help push the narrative along, hopefully, to see change happen. So I will happily receive that. I appreciate you asking, man. So with that being said,
Uh,
tell me some other ways we can keep learning because I want to keep learning.
yeah. So if you wanna, so on Instagram, I'm at GS Hightower. I also have an informative, kind of fun page where I talk about just different things that Black educators talk to their students about, and that's at the Lorax, Loreax. Um, Also, I also got to give a shout out to S. Brown, not necessarily a colleague, but a fellow teacher of color. She makes these excellent shirts and some other merchandise. You can find her at Teach for the Culture on Instagram. And then in terms of resources, if you're an educator and you're looking at trying to, everything right now is about ABAR, anti-racist, anti-bias. But if you want to have a worksheet or some sort of guide that can help you learn how to have conversations and then have some follow-up steps and work kind of like in a worksheet sort of format. I would invite you to read Everyday Anti-Racism. It's there is no author. It's just a amalgamation, I guess, or a compilation of a number of different essays from prominent educators that will give your district leadership team or your school leadership team or your teachers an opportunity to kind of go through some ideas and examples of how to bolster your school and maybe change some of their core values to include all the students, not just a few of the students. And then if you're really interested in some deeper philosophy, I've been reading a psychiatrist named Frantz Fanon, and because I have this busing um, uh, directive that I have, I've been reading a book by him called what is it, Black Skin, White Masks. So
Okay.
that just gives you an insight on um, some of the ways that people of color try to find ways to assimilate
Mm,
in a very homogenized white society. So that
wow.
could give you some insight in a more of a technical term on
Yeah.
why people do what they do. So you see people like Kanye, and you hear people calling him, Uncle Tom, this, that, or the other, but there's a psychology behind it. So it might
Mm.
help with some answers.
That's good. I'm gonna pick up. I haven't heard of that book before, so I
Great,
love a good philosophy book. So I'm gonna pick that one up and read that
great.
as well. I appreciate you sharing tonight, Grant. Thank you for taking time out of your Thursday night to come on late and talk with us a little bit. I do want to just remind people that things aren't ever going to just change overnight. That it takes intentionality and it takes a sense of humility, as Grant mentioned tonight, for us to continue to learn and to grow. We recognize that we're not all the same, but at the end of the day, we all get to learn from one another. And that ought to be the end goal, to recognize that we didn't all grow up the same, but we all can learn from one another. And hopefully, at the end of this all, our kids have the opportunity to grow up in a different world than we did. and that'll come through us being willing to have conversations, hard conversations, awkward conversations at points. But those conversations will lead to change. And so, Grant, thank you so much, man, for
Appreciate you,
taking
bro.
time tonight. Encourage you guys to go on, find us on any of the social medias or any of our platforms. You can find all of our podcasts or anything else, videos on YouTube, Facebook, and all the audio platforms. We'll see you guys next week. I have my buddy Raymond Medley coming on to talk through dealing with youth in this issue as well and hearing his story. It's going to be a really good one. So appreciate you guys. Y'all have a good night.